Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another session of the Artist Roundtable, which is a seminar within the Curatorial Practice Program, the MFA program run by Stephen Madoff at the School of Visual Arts in New York. I'm David Ross, and I actually chair a different graduate program, the Art Practice Program. But for a number of years, I've been doing this class for the Curatorial Practice Program because I do think it's an interesting time for artists to be in discussion and in conversation with young curators, and it's a very important part of the development of their practice. We're very happy to have with us today Andre Serrano, who I've known for quite some time. Andre is a New York artist living and working in New York, but whose work has had a global impact. His work deals with issues of spirituality and the politics of spirituality, of issues of identity. Approached from a variety of perspectives. His work takes the form of photographs, although he's done some other projects along the way. And we're really pleased to have him showing us a body of his work today and talking about his work and the evolution of his practice and where things stand today for an artist who in many ways came to define the culture wars back in the 1980s and early 90s. And now has a curious position, in a world that now kind of understands his work in many ways that seemed impossible back then. So, hi, Andre. Good to see you.
Good to see you, David.
I'm going to open your images up, and we can get started as soon as I get that going. All right.
Sure.
So, screen's all yours and I will listen to your prompts for moving the images along.
All right. So, I'm going to give you an overview of my work. I think I'm like some artists who, if no one asked them anything about their work, they wouldn't say anything about it. I'm happy not to talk about my work. I find some people are really some artists are really quite, what's the word? Inarticulate when it comes to their work, but if they're lucky, they have somebody writing a script for them, meaning text, but I can easily speak about my work, but I like to speak about it with images better, because this way you see what I'm talking about rather than words. I mean, if words were my specialty, I would write. And even though I can write, I've never written, except for a book of poems, actually, that I've written recently that I need to publish. But words are my medium, or rather pictures are my medium. And so I'll show you photographs of my art practice. Now, before I show you anything, I will say one thing. Since we're talking about, since you're in school, I studied at the Brooklyn Museum Art School when I was 17. I dropped out of high school to go to art school. And at the Brooklyn Museum Art School, I studied painting and sculpture. After 2 years of, being in school, my time was up. And at the time, I lived with a girl who had a camera. So I felt like I couldn't really paint or sculpt the way I wanted. I didn't have enough room for a studio. So I started taking pictures with Millie's camera. But since the beginning, I saw myself as an artist using a camera for my art practice, and deciding early on back then that I would limit my art practice to taking photographs. So this is one of my early works. It's called Dread. And a lot of times my pictures are literal. The titles are quite literal, because I want to give you as much information as I can without putting a wall text, next to the picture. And so the picture is called Dread. It's the back of my friend's head, Michael Coulter, a good friend of mine. So it's called Dread, D-R-E-A-D, and it refers, of course, to dread, but also the word dread has another meaning for me in this case, and it's the fear of Black people, the fear of the unknown, particularly of people of color. This is, again, early work. And the early work is what I call tableau photographs, tableau photography. There's a person, a backdrop, a subject, a theme. This is called Heaven and Hell. And the subject on the right is Leon Golub, the artist, who was very friendly to young artists, and Leon and Nancy Spiro were really friendly to me, great people. And so he, I asked Leon to pose as a cardinal in a cardinal outfit that I got from the cardinal store. You can go to the religious store and buy religious clothing, the real thing. And so, so this is called Heaven and Hell. And Leon, a great guy with a great sense of humor, he loved doing the picture. Next. This is called Cabeza de Vaca, which literally means cow's head. Cabeza de Vaca was also the name of a 15th century Spanish explorer. It's a portrait of a cow. And, even though the cow is obviously dead, I like to imbue life into what I photograph. And there's also a sense of self-identification with what I photograph. People have asked me, have you done a self-portrait? And I say, no, all of my work is a self-portrait, including this one. Next. It's called Meat Weapon, and it's a young actor named Lawrence Fishburne that I met, through my friend Michael Coulter in the early 80s. And Larry, as he was known then, he was known as Larry to his friends, was a good sport. He posed for me, and he's holding a piece of meat as a weapon. Larry had just done this movie Apocalypse Now, where he machine gunned a bunch of Vietnamese people with a machine gun on a boat. Next. At some point, I got a studio visit from Bill Olander, who was the chief curator at the New Museum at the time in 1986. And Bill came to me. He was doing a show called Fake with all these postmodern artists of the time. And even though I didn't feel like my work belonged in the show, still, Bill had always been very supportive of my work. And after his visit, I started to think about, the show was called Fake. I started thinking about doing fake paintings, doing something that looked like one thing but was another. And so I decided to do this image called Milk Blood. It's two tanks, one filled with one filled with milk, with the other one with blood. And it refers to Mondrian. And I felt I was doing something very radical for me, and in terms of photography too, meaning there was no subject matter, there was no foreground, no background, there was nothing except color. And so with this image is when I start the bodily fluid pictures, which you'll see now. Next. And again, I thought it was something very different for photography, because I was treating photographs as if they were paintings. I was making paintings, fake paintings with my photographs. This is called Milk, and it's a monochrome of milk, and of course, because you don't see the edges of the tank, it's only white. Next. This is blood. It's a monochrome of blood. And, I like to title my images very, very specifically, literal, with literal titles if necessary, so you know what you're looking at. So it's not just a red picture. It's not just a red paint. It's blood. Next. This image I'm very proud of, because it's one of the images where I combine sperm, semen, and blood together. And and did it very close up. And this image was used by Metallica for their album Load.
Hmm.
And so I was very, very proud that not only that they knew my work, but that they wanted it as well. But that was Kirk Lars and Kirk and rather Lars and Kirk, you know.
Mhm.
This is called Piss Christ, and this is my first immersion. The immersions are when I start to put objects, small objects, into the fluids. Before, the fluids were just, you know, very abstract images of blood and milk and piss. Uh, and those are known as the bodily fluids series. But the immersions is when I start to put objects inside the fluids. And the first immersion is Piss Christ, which made sense to me because I had been doing, you know, religious images before I got into the bodily fluids, and so it made sense to me to refer in the first representational work within the bodily fluid context to refer to religion. And so people have said, but why did you call it that? It would have been okay if you called it something else. But for me, it was piss, it was Christ. So obviously it had to be Piss Christ. Not meaning to be offensive and not meaning to be blasphemous, certainly not, because I'm a Christian. I've been a Christian all my life. I was born and raised a Catholic. And even though I stopped going to church after confirmation, meaning I stopped receiving the Holy Eucharist. But still, I go to churches, but only in Europe because I see them as beautiful temples of you know, religious art. And so I go to them as I would to a museum. I go to more churches in Europe than I go to museums, in fact. But in terms of religion, you know, I'm a Christian, so there's no doubt for me that I am not a blasphemous artist. Next. It's called Pistiscus. Again, another immersion. Next. And Piss Elegans. You know, sometimes artists have ideas, and it's one thing to have an idea, but then you think about, particularly when you're doing photographs, you know, and you're not painting, you think about how am I going to do this, or is it going to look good? In deciding to work with bodily fluids, particularly with the piss pictures, I realized the first piss picture, the Piss Christ, the lights are in front of the tank. For the rest of for the other immersions, piss immersions, now the lights are in front and also behind the tank. So it gives me this bright yellow. So I was very happy that the piss pictures were able to give me this very bright yellow backdrop. And that's what made it better for me, because as I said, you know, you have an idea in your head, and until you do it, you don't know how it's going to look. So it always feels good when it looks even better than you expected. Next. This is Madonna and Child.
Hmm.
Next. So I went down the line of bodily fluids that I wanted to engage with, and at some point I decided to do these ejaculate in trajectories. I did several of them. And if there's a self-portrait, I would say that's a self-portrait there. And so what I liked about these images is that I had no control over the image itself, because, you know, the camera, you know, I had to get a model, what do you call it, a timer for the, you know, for these pictures. And so I never had to, I never knew exactly, you know, what the image would have, you know, but because I was using a motor drive, I was clicking a lot of images all at once, you know, maybe 36 pictures within a few seconds. And so only one image would capture the ejaculate, you know, and, but again, because of the fact that, particularly because of the fact that I was dealing with abstract images, I like that the process itself was somewhat abstracted for me as well, in that I didn't have control over what the final outcome would look like. Next. And I've always done, I always work with color photographs. So even though these black and white images, they're still color photographs. Next.
Hmm.
Next. This is another bodily fluid. It's a close up of menstrual blood, which I got from my wife at the time, and I did a whole series of these. I called them Red River because she had told me that that's what they called, the menses in high school, Red River, and so I did a whole, bunch of them, and blown up big. You could see them on one way as abstractions, and if you don't know what they are, they're just abstractions. But then when you know what they are, then they take on another meaning. Next. So at some point, I decided I was done with the bodily fluids, and I decided to do some portraits. And so I embarked on a series called Nomads from 1990. And these pictures were inspired by Edward Curtis. And I loved Curtis's work that he did of Native Americans, in late 19th century. And even though Curtis has been, he's been criticized for giving his models props, something to wear. I mean, for me, it doesn't matter because to me that's like being a postmodernist artist, setting things up. But what I get from Curtis is the dignity of his sitters, and so I wanted to achieve that kind of classic, monumental, portrait with this series. And these are homeless people that I photographed late at night in the subways with a backdrop, and assistance. With lights and assistance, because I wanted to remove them from where they were and put them into the same kind of tableau photography setup as Edward Curtis had done in using a backdrop for his portraits. Next.
Hmm.
Next. I remember Bertha, and we found her in Times Square, Tompkins Square Park late at night, on our way to the subway to photograph. And I asked her to pose, and she said, "Sure." And she said, "It's not going to be naked, is it?" I said, "No." Next. So after doing the nomad portraits, I decided I wanted to continue to make some more portraits, and I thought, well, I want them to be different, unusual, and so I thought, well, if someone had a mask, that's an unusual portrait right there. And so when I thought of masked people, I immediately thought of the Klan, and because I'm not white, I'm Hispanic. Because of that too, it was a challenge for me, and a goal, to work with the Klan. Next. This is the Imperial Wizard. He's got a different costume or robe, I should say. Next. It's funny that in working with the Klan, of course, people say, "Hey, did you see what they look like?" Well, I had to negotiate with them. They just didn't appear in my studio dressed up like that without me having talked to them about it in advance. And so when I met them, they're not wearing their hoods and robes, But I and basically we had okay conversations. But I noticed this man in particular, Danny, he seemed very easygoing, and we photographed it on his porch late at night. Oh, maybe it was 11 o'clock at night in Georgia. and I hear the wife saying, "Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up!" Yeah. But what struck me about this Danny and this pictures before the conversation, before taking the picture, Danny, he was just a regular guy. And when he put on the robe and the hood and the mask, it's like they transform into something else. And all of a sudden, he wasn't the same guy I was talking to a few seconds ago. He had this aura and this power that he did not have a few minutes ago. And I think it's the same thing with religious figures, whether it be a priest, a nun, a bishop. We see them one way, and without their garments, we would see them as regular people. But once they put on those garments, they become symbols, and though they have a power that they don't as regular people. Next.
Mm-hmm.
That's cut off, Irina. Why is that? Yeah, that should be a vertical image. I don't know why it's a horizontal one.
I can't change it.
Yeah, that's okay. So now we get to the morgue photographs of the dead that I did, in 1992. And this is again, I don't know anything about these people except the cause of death, and so that's how the pictures are titled, by the cause of death. And this picture is called Jane Doe Killed by Police. And I got access to a morgue because I met the man in charge of this particular morgue. I said, "Can I come in?" And he said, "Yeah, you can come in and photograph." He said, "Over the years, though, I told two different people came to me who wanted to take pictures here, a man and a woman." And he said after the first day, they never came back. So, when he told me that, as soon as we walked into the morgue, I saw a child about 8 years old on the autopsy table being opened up. And she was a very beautiful child, freckles, red hair. And I was shocked to see her be opened up like that. But I quickly put on my robe and masks and started working, because I knew I came there to do work, and I wasn't going to let anything interfere with my ability to take pictures in the morgue. Next. This is called Rat Poison Suicide. And I had the permission of the man in charge of the morgue, with the understanding that no one would be recognizable. Next. This is called Gunshot or Gun Murder. Now, I think of this as kind of like a reference to the shortened body of Christ.
Mm.
Next. This is a burn victim smoking in bed. Next. This is called fatal meningitis. Next. And this is hacked to death. This man was hacked to death by his wife, who stabbed him with a large kitchen knife about 23 times. Interestingly, this image was used on a new version of the New Testament years ago. But I think they did it, and then they switched the cover to something else because they might have gotten some kind of reaction. But they did do it. Yeah. Next. And this is a John Doe baby. I mean, I like this image that this, even though this baby was actually, this baby it's part of the Unborn series, where the baby was born dead. But I feel like there's so much resolve and strength in that fist, even though the baby never had a life. Next. So this is from a series called A History of Sex. I was invited to do a show at the Groningen Museum in Holland, in Groningen. And they said, before the show opens, we want you to come to Holland to do some, the curator said, we want you to come to Holland to do some work here. And I said, well, I told the curator, Mark, I started a new body of work. It's called A History of Sex. So I don't have time to go to Holland to do some work about the Dutch. And he said, oh, if you're doing sex pictures, why don't you come to Amsterdam? And so it made sense. And I went to Amsterdam to do that series. Even though this one was done in Rome, I did the work both in Rome and later in Amsterdam. Next. I think of my pictures as portraits, no matter what it is, whether the subject is death, whether it's the Klan, whether it's sex. It's always about the face, So I think of, I like to humanize my subjects, my subject matter with people, with human faces, the face. And I think that's one of the reasons why initially I was so drawn to photography, is because I find a lot of power in the human face. Next. Next. Yeah, even this, I think of it as a portrait of this man. His name is Rietveld. And I did this one in Holland. And I remember at the time, uh, I asked him, oh, I found out he was gay. So I said, do you want to do a man to man shot? And he said, no, no. He said, no, I won't want my mother to see that. He said, okay. So I said, how about a masturbation shot? He said, okay. And afterwards, I showed him this image, the one that I was going to use. And he says, see, here with this shot, I'd be very proud for my mother to see this. Next. This is called The Cardinal Proves He's Only Human. This is part of a series called The Interpretation of Dreams. Normally, my series are usually one subject done 12, 14, 15, 20, 50 times, but it's one subject. But I decided to do a show called The Interpretation of Dreams, of course, referring to Sigmund Freud's book. And because this way I was able to do images that would be singular, meaning one-offs, and so I think of it as being a kind of surreal show. Next. This is called Black Santa. And for this image, I selected a man that I had found on the street, living on the street, Paul. And it's funny because I took this picture and somehow it wound up on the cover of an Italian magazine. And I ran into Paul a couple of years later, and I saw him looking inside the Strand window late at night. And I was looking, he wasn't looking, I was looking inside the Strand window. And then I saw a reflection of a homeless person behind me. And I thought, that's Paul. I'd say, Paul? I said, do you remember me? And he said, how can I forget you? You made me famous. And he felt like, because he saw that, the picture had been on the front cover of this magazine, he felt like I gave his life some meaning, and so that I made him famous. And so, I mean, I was touched by that, I'm always touched when the people I photograph are touched by the photographs that they see. Before, we saw during the Nomad pictures, there's a picture of a man who's got like a fur hat, Johnny. And I remember having a show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. and that picture was on the wall, a big version of it, a big size version of it. And the curator one day, she went into the room and she saw a woman crying, and she said, "What's wrong?" And it turned out to be Johnny's mother. And Johnny's mother explained that, yeah, Johnny, he was a nomad. He never could settle down anywhere. He was always roaming the streets and this and that. And Johnny had since passed away, and she was crying because she was so impressed by this image of Johnny that she saw now in the museum.
Wow.
Next. This is Laurie and Dory. These are Siamese twins. These are real twins, I shoot film. I always shot film, and I don't manipulate my images. The way you see them is, the way I shot them. So they are Siamese twins. And one was shorter than the other. So, the little one, Laurie, she had to be on a cart. Next. It's called The Other Christ. Again, it's from the Interpretation of Dreams. Next. So shortly after September 11th, I felt I had to do something that referred to the 11th. And so I started a new body of work called America, where I photographed people who I felt represented America in some way. Because I felt like the attacks, for me, meant that America was seen as the enemy. And so I wanted to show, and for myself, I wanted to see and show who the enemy is. And I remember running into Nancy Spiro at the time I was doing my America show, about to show it. And I told, I was very excited and said, "Nancy, I'm doing this show called America, blah, blah, blah." And she said, "Who's America?" And I say, "Why, my America, of course, Nancy." And that's how it is. Everyone's got their version of America. And so this was mine. Next. And at the time, a lot of people, I mean, your students, probably some of them weren't even born at the time, maybe, or were barely toddlers. But there was an anthrax scare. Anthrax was sent through the mail. And so the postal workers became heroes of 9/11, a very important symbol of 9/11. And I started with the symbols of 9/11. Next. Airline pilot, because pilots were involved in that attack on the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon. And and so you wanted to refer to 9/11 specifically. Now I want to say something about this portrait. It's a portrait of Captain Tracy Thompson. This woman, Tracy, she had lived with me for several years. She was my girlfriend for several years. And when I met her, she was a flight attendant, and she had just started taking flying lessons because she wanted to be a pilot. So by the time we split up, she had already become a pilot, but I had never taken Tracy's picture because it's hard for me to take a picture of anybody or of anything if I'm not doing it for real, as a body of work, as a work of art. And so I had never taken Tracy's picture until I started America. And now I called her back to the studio so I could take a portrait of her as Captain Tracy Thompson. Next. And again, referring to the symbols of 9/11. This is a firefighter, one of two firefighters that I photographed. And someone had said to me, actually, Paula Cooper, I was with Paula Cooper Gallery at the time. Paula Cooper said to me, "He looks tired." And I thought, you're right. Yeah, I mean, he looks sad, somber, but he looked tired because these guys, they had been digging through the rubble for months. And when he came to the studio, he obviously, he had stuff on him. Obviously they had been working down there for months on end. And so, they were sad, but they were also tired. Next. And this is an FBI agent in a hazmat suit.
Hmm.
Except for the interpretation of dreams, where I have people put on costumes for me. People I photograph are real Klansmen, real FBI agent, real everything. I like to work with the real thing rather than fake it. Next. Um, this is called Convert to Islam, because she is a convert to Islam. Next. So again, for 9/11, for the America series, and these are people who are symbols, but they're also human beings. So I photograph both the symbol and the actual person. Next. Uh, this man was a set designer, and I had seen him in a bar, fetish bar, for Valentine's Day party. And he was dressed like that with the flowers and everything. And I said, "Oh, I want to take a portrait of you dressed like this." And he said, "Oh, what about the flowers? I only got them for Halloween. Uh, Normally, of course, I wouldn't have flowers for not for Valentine's Day." Uh, so I say, "Oh yeah, bring the flowers too." You have to be specific with people when you see them somewhere and you want to photograph them. You have to tell them, bring everything, look just the way you are. Because on occasion, I've told someone, "Yeah, I like the way you look," and they come and they're not looking the way I saw them. So what I see is what I want. Yeah. I remember one time I went with a friend of mine, Moni, to Istanbul to do some work, and we saw a man in a window who was, obviously he had difficulties. He was challenged in some way. You could see physically and mentally he was challenged. And I said to him, "Oh, Moni, I want to photograph this man." And he said, "Oh, we can go to the hospital and I can get you somebody like that." And I said, "I don't want somebody like that. I want this man." And so we met the family. We had dinner with them. We talked about it, and then I was able to convince them that to let him pose for me. And I remember at the time that even though he was challenged physically and mentally, I would say, turn this way a little bit, turn this way, and he would do it. So it showed me that he liked, he understood the process. He understood we're doing a collaboration here, and uh, and he was happy to work with me. Snoop Dogg. Yeah, I photographed Snoop Dogg. He was in town, and I made sure to get him because I wanted to photograph Snoop. I remember about a month earlier, I had photographed P. Diddy for a magazine, Newsweek, and you know, e- even though I thought, oh, maybe I can put him in America, but you know, P. Diddy, he was such a pain about the model release, and this and that. Maybe do a picture of my children, blah blah blah. So when Snoop, who I really was the one who I really wanted, when Snoop said yes, I was happy to be able to just deal with Snoop, and Snoop was great. I remember at the time when it was time to give him the model release, I said, "Snoop, you know, I really appreciate you posing for me because I'm not doing it for a magazine. It's for my work. I'm an artist." And Snoop told me, he said, "Well, I'm an artist too, so I understand."
Huh.
So he was amazing. And this is BB King, who again part of the America series. So basically, after I spent about 3 years doing America, and after going through all the people that I wanted to go through, the celebrities were the last group of people that I got to because I knew they would be the most difficult, and so I wanted to get most of the work done before I approached them. And fortunately, I have a good number of celebrities said yes to me. Next. This is a Klansman, and I believe he's a pastor as well. Next. And this is a World War II Battle of the Bulge hero. You know, a lot of times when I photograph people, I only have a few minutes with them, very little time. And sometimes I hear conversations with assistants talking, but mostly I don't talk much to them. I may ask something if I'm curious, but really I don't want to break the concentration, their concentration or mine. And so I prefer if they just sit still and not say anything. But I do hear things. Uh, but my relationship with my subjects is after the picture. I mean, that's when I can look at the picture, I can remember the person, and I can see more. Because this moment now is everlasting, more than that fleeting moment I had with them. I can see, I can really see into them. And I often, would take like 100 pictures and then choose one, and that one image would be the one. It's kind of like what Henri Cartier-Bresson had in mind when he said the decisive moment, meaning there's only one, and that's the one, that you choose. And so I'm very happy when I find the one. Next, Yoko Ono.
Beautiful.
Next. And Pimp. I did a book of America and other work with Taschen. And I remember I said, oh, can we put the Boy Scout on the cover? And he said, no children on the cover, because there were sex pictures inside, the history of sex, there was death, he said, no children on the cover. And I said, okay, can we do the pimp? He said, fine, pimp is fine. Next. I remember this girl, she was very cute. I believe she was 6 years old, and she had been competing for a while, since she was, very young. And when I asked her, how old she told me she had been competing since she was 3. And I said, oh, how old are you now? She said 6. I said, oh, so you've been competing for half your life. She didn't get that. Next. And Donald Trump. I had to photograph Donald Trump from 2004 for my America series, because Donald Trump represented something. At the time, he was the American dream come true. He was also Donald Trump, and oddly enough, Donald Trump is still Donald Trump, and he also represents something. Some call it the American dream, others call it the American nightmare. I always say my work is open to interpretation. Next. So I decided to do a show called Shit, and close up of shit, different kinds of shit. This is bullshit, meaning it's from a bull. Next. This is good shit. Next. The thing about good shit and bad shit and bullshit, and there's also another one called bad shit that's not there. The thing about that was it was all from they were all it was all bullshit, meaning all that shit, good shit, bad shit, and good shit, bullshit, good shit, bad shit, all came from the same. It came from different bulls, but it was all bullshit. And it was a saying for me. It was a way of saying things are relative. It's all bullshit, but whether it's good shit, bad shit, it's all relative. It's all in the eyes of the beholder. It's all how you can spin it. It's all how the audience sees it. The audience will accept one thing from one person, but not the same thing from another, because they don't like that person, or they don't respect that person, or that person has no weight. They have no juice. So we are very subjective when it comes to appreciating and understanding things around us. I believe this is jaguar shit, and this is chicken shit. You know, there was a feather within the chicken shit. Next. I call this Hieronymus Bosch shit because to me it looks like a creature from a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. Next. This is called heroic shit because it looks like very heroic, like a storming of the mountain, leading a charge. This piece of shit is leading the charge. Next. And this is from one of the last series I did. It is actually the last series I did called The Robots. And these are robots. They're, again, portraits of robots. And these robots are vintage robots. They're real robots. They're not cheap imitations. They're the real thing. And I can tell you I spent a lot of money on eBay getting these fuckers, you know, because things are not cheap, you know, especially when they're old and original. They are not cheap, and neither were the robots. And so, but again, I think of these robots as being humanoid, human-like. This was done a few years ago, and it referred to the metaverse. It referred to the fact that the future, when the robots were, you know, came about in the 50s, even before, but some of these robots were 50s, 60s, 70s. You know, these robots were meant to be part of the future. You know, now the future is here, and we have the robots. We've gone beyond the robots. We've gone into the metaverse. But before the metaverse, there were robots. Next. Again, you know, for me, these are human-like features that these robots have. And I think of them as characters. Like I said before, every face has a human-like appearance for me. And even when it's not human, it still has a human presence, meaning I respond to it as I would to a human being. So I try to humanize these creatures in some way, even though they're not human. They also look like superheroes.
Yeah.
Next. And I photographed all kinds of robots. There were white robots, there were black robots, there were red robots, all kinds of robots. I think of them as a race of robots.
I think that may be the last picture. Yeah.
Okay, great. So now we're on to the next phase.
Yeah, and we had two questions that one of the viewers asked, and I thought we could, before we go into a session with the graduate students, you can see them on the screen here, but or maybe you can't. The first question was, how did you gain access to the KKK?
I asked him. It wasn't easy, you know. I had to ask the right person, and I asked 2 or 3 people in Atlanta. You know, I had been to Atlanta once, and I met a few people, and I called several of them. And one person was able to get me a contact with the Klan, and so that was it, you know. But once I got there, I had to also convince the individual people, the Klan's people that I met, to pose for me. And at first, they weren't posing. They didn't want to pose. And finally, one said yes, and then the next one said yes. And you know, and actually, and then finally, the David Holland, the Imperial Wizard, he decided to pose for me, and you know, and that was thanks to his lawyer who convinced him, and who happened to be Jewish.
Isn't that interesting? And did the Klan care that you were Hispanic or?
No, no. Well, you know, yes and no. Because when I spoke to Bobby on the phone, I said to Bobby, you know, I want to photograph the Klan. And she said, oh, yeah, Bobby, this lady, she'd been with the James Venable, who was the ex-Imperial Wizard. He was in his 80s, but she would have been his secretary, I guess, for 40 years. And so I said, listen, she said, if you come down it was in September. She said, if you come down 3 weeks from now, and the Klan is they're all going to be here. There's a big rally. They come here for 5 days. And so there's a big, huge rally. So if you come down, I can introduce you to people. And I said, okay, that's great, Bobby, that's great. And then I said, I got to tell you one thing. I'm not white, I'm Hispanic. Is that going to be a problem? And she said to me, it won't be a problem at all, baby. And then, but when I got there, it was a problem because later when I got there, I realized Bobby doesn't like to be around the Klan when they all come to town. So she disappeared. So I had to make new contacts within the Klan again and everything. But eventually, yeah.
Okay, so we have time for two more quick questions. The first one is, what are your thoughts about people who react angrily to your work, thinking of the Piss Christ photo that got slashed in 2011?
Okay. So, even though it hurts my feelings sometimes when they write me nasty things, and I'm sorry that they get so upset, but at the same time, I feel like if they're disturbed by this, they should think about what the crucifixion actually symbolizes, the horrible death of a man on a cross. And not only did the blood come out, everything else came out too when he died. And so, but at the same time, I realize that if you get upset, it's better than no reaction, because that means that it affected you. It was a powerful moment for you. And so if I can do that for a person, if I can get them excited, even in a negative way, I feel like I've done something, because they're not excited about it. They're not complaining about anything else. They're not overly excited about any other artwork. And so the fact that I can provoke even a negative experience is okay for me.
Sure. And then finally, of all your work that you've done to date, which is, or body of work, which is the most important to you and why?
I have favorites from different series, like this one from the Morgue and that one. I mean, the Piss Christ is obviously very important. Although, if not for the controversy, it wouldn't have really stood out for me. But it all depends on the series. Different pictures for me, depending on the series. I have my favorites from different series.
Sure. Well, listen, thank you for participating in this webinar. We're now going to sign off here, and then I will see you on the Zoom with the graduate students in this program. So
Okay.
See you in a few minutes.
Okay, sure.
Okay, and thank you all for coming again this week, and we'll see you again next week, which will be, I think, also an equally interesting week. We're going to be looking at another artist whose medium is photography, also a man named Richard Barnes, who works does kind of archaeological photographs, as well as other work that's come out of that occupation. So we'll see you all next week, and again, thanks for watching.